Great. Look, good evening all, and welcome to this, our third, I think, Meet the Leaders, which I'll just describe for those of you who are not familiar with it. As part of the Big Tent suite of products, we do webinars on particular themes central to our core mission of regeneration and innovation and the power of fresh thinking in driving the levelling up and the regeneration of people and places left behind. The Meet the Leaders is our exclusive forum for our patrons and for our members and friends. Members and friends pay, I think, George, is it £10 a month to belong? And our patrons are serious supporters of projects, anything from 2K a year to 5K to some have even been so good as to do 10K a year. We're about to set out a series of projects, a menu of projects this year, which we're keen to pursue. And if any of you are interested and would like to be part of that, it's a nice chance to sponsor a big tent, a church pew, a particular project, be it a young leader development scheme or our Lifetime Achievement Awards or specific projects out around the country. And I'll say a bit more about that at the end. So our core focus, as you will have picked up after 3 years of trying to heal the damage of the appalling Brexit, partisan politics, the civil war, the murder of an MP, we've decided in this next phase to focus on the core issue at the heart of that domestic pathology of anger, which is people and places left behind. But not just to talk about it, we want to make a positive, practical difference. So we're looking to take our Big Tent festival format, the Leadership Summit on the Friday afternoon, and then the Saturday festival around the country to support those many places that are looking to make this an opportunity to really catch up and in their own way to increase life chances and opportunity in a fairer model of growth. And we're in the middle of closing down some very interesting opportunities to take the Big Tent to some areas that people may be surprised by. More on that anon. And the Meet the Leaders is about exploring the real leadership behind turning things around, the spirit of leadership and the practicalities of doing it. And I'm really delighted tonight to welcome David Cleevely. David will be known to many of you, those who take an interest in technology. I first came across David when I was a younger, thinner and hairier man in the Cambridge cluster. And David is a polymath, I think he won't mind me saying. He's a proud engineer by every instinct and original professional training. He's got a mug to show it. He's also there's the mug, a founder of a number of hugely successful companies, not least Abcam and many others. He's a restaurateur, but he's also, unusually for many technology entrepreneurs, he's actually got involved in some very important work locally in Cambridgeshire to try and drive out better infrastructure, which is key to spreading the opportunities of that fabulous city to some of the rural hinterland, which has been left behind. You may be surprised to know that bits of Cambridgeshire are capitals of rural deprivation, heroin, and deep poverty, not 30 miles from one of the world's fastest growing and most prosperous cities. So David comes with huge experience of starting and building companies, of working across silos, insisting that science is important, yes, but engineering with science is really more powerful. He's done a lot of work on COVID this year at quite a high level on some of the engineering aspects of how you roll out vaccines. And David, you've also been a great patron of the Big Tent and brought in several others. So thank you for all of your support for what we're doing, trying to do. We deeply believe that real regeneration needs fresh conversations, it needs fresh partnerships, and it needs fresh approaches. And if it's going to be economically dynamic, it probably needs some tomorrow economics and some innovation in there. It can't just be hanging baskets and flowers on the roundabout. If we're going to let Grimsby and Stoke and Teesside and Yarmouth and Peterborough really make this a moment of transformation, they're going to need to have place-based and genuine visions of how they as places can grow. And that'll mean some innovative thinking. So David, warm welcome. Over to you. Give us a burst of whatever you want, and then I shall do my best to chair what I know is going to be a lively conversation.
Right, great. Thank you very much indeed, George. It's a great pleasure to be here. Great pleasure to see so many old friends, including one John Goddard, who John, you won't remember me, but I think we actually met when I was up in Newcastle doing a project on the microelectronics centre and
yeah,
regeneration.
I remember.
You remember? So,
Yeah.
so you take me back. I think it must be more than 40 years to the point where I was first actually encountering some of these issues up in the northeast. So I just thought I'd just make a call out for that one, because it's nice to see you. Nice to see you again. Right. So let's if we can get the presentation on the road. I don't know how this works.
While you're doing that, David, while you're doing that, can I just say a warm word also to all of you who've joined? There's a huge number of people. We've got a wonderful mix. I can see Daniel Zeitner, the MP for Cambridge. Welcome, Daniel. I can see people from real leaders in regeneration around the country, from all around the country. So welcome to you all. I'm not going to go through all of your distinguished CVs and backgrounds, but David, you've got a cracking audience on tech clusters.
Great. Here we go. Right. Thank you, George. So here's a picture which I chose to illustrate the talk, building tech clusters. And it's an important picture because it's Joseph Wright of Derby's picture. I think it's 1786 or so. And it's a very important picture for two reasons. Number one, it's illustrating how science in particular was attracting a great deal of attention in the 18th century. And what you see there is the bird in the vacuum pump. The air is being extracted and demonstrating that the bird cannot survive without the air. And of course, the young girls are looking rather distressed by the whole thing. But the second point, which is sometimes missed when you look at this picture, is up towards the top right, and that's the moon. And the reason why the moon is important is because Wright was referring to a group of people who were part of what was called the Lunar Society. In fact, there were a number of lunar societies, but the one based in Birmingham was probably the most important. And there were lunar societies because you couldn't travel at night unless you had light. So you traveled on the nights of the full moon. And you travel for a purpose, and the purpose was to gather to discuss ideas, to discuss the new science, to discuss the new engineering, to discuss the new stuff that was happening. And those lunar societies and that networking, primarily in the north, though we'd already seen the emergence of it with the Royal Society and the networking that went on in the 1600s in London, they were the power, they were the generators of the Industrial Revolution. Without that networking, we would not have had the Industrial Revolution that we now know took place after beginning at that date and then moving forward into the 19th century and turning the UK into an economic powerhouse. Now, let's look at some other economic powerhouses. Beijing, that's my keyword for moving the slide along. Let's look at Silicon Valley, Beijing, in 1938. And this is pretty well the peak of Silicon Valley in 1938. It's Bill Hewitt's garage. And Hewlett and Packard decided that they would do a coin toss. I hope I don't make any more of those mistakes later on. They could be embarrassing. A coin toss for how they would name their HP calculator business. And they decided that they would build calculators and use the new electronics to do it. And they would do it, first of all, in this garage. Now, this garage is not quite the same as the one that Bill Hewitt actually inhabited, because this one has a toilet. And in 1938, they couldn't afford a toilet. So Bill had to live in that garage and do all the work without any sanitary or washing facilities. Now, you've got to understand that Silicon Valley at that point had already begun the process that we see now, and which flowered mainly during the 50s and 60s and then into the 70s. We'll talk about what happens later, but had already begun that process. So let's look at the next slide and let's look at what was actually going on. Because Silicon Valley was actually decades in the making. And I'm going to look at this in two halves. The period up to about 1970 and the period after that. So let's look at the graphic of this. Paching. Here we are. So, of course, Silicon Valley was about the far west, was about exploiting the minerals and those kinds of things, attracted a whole load of entrepreneurs and interesting people. But most important strategically for the United States, the United States had to secure the West Coast. So it did a whole load of things to do with Navy, radio engineering, and electrical engineering over on the West Coast. And that produced all sorts of kinds of hobbyists and other people. But let's look at some of the most important. I'm going to look at 5 of them. Number 1, there was the founding of Stanford. I've obscured Berkeley. If anybody went to Berkeley, I really, really apologize for that. But the founding of Stanford was first. And Stanford then produced the alumni, attracted the people who would then go on to found the rest of those companies. Number two is, unsurprisingly, the hippies. The hippie movement on the West Coast was absolutely vital for engineering the kind of cultural change. You've got to remember that Steve Jobs was a hippie. I mean, you know, the old rumors about mucus and apples and why Apple got founded as a company is linked to that cultural change. And number 3 are the integrated circuits and microprocessors, which came out of government intervention, Fairchild Semiconductors, and the invention of the integrated circuit. All of those things with huge government money. Remember, the United States has always spent vast amounts of government money procuring from the private sector to supply, particularly in defense. And then number 4, and really important, is immigration. Over half of the CEOs in Silicon Valley are first or second generation immigrants. And then finally, you get the venture capitalists who are essentially recycling other people's money. And I'll come to why that's important a bit later. Now, there's a whole load of other things in there, but I wanted to pick out those 5 because they really come to the core of what we need to do when we're thinking about this long-term regeneration. Let's get the next slide. And the other thing that I want to bring out in this is that we're all connected. Everybody's obviously connected to everybody else. We found that out as a result of this COVID epidemic. But the issue that I want to point out is that those connections have shrunk the world. It used to be 6 degrees of freedom. It's now far less. But in those clusters and places that are successful, those networks are very active and they deliver an awful lot of resources to people. And these aren't just accidental byproducts of the system. This serendipity of how I bump into Jonathan Milner, and as a result, I start a company like Abcam with him. That's not a kind of accident in the sense, of course, it's an accident, it's a chance meeting, but it's actually a property of the system. And it's one of the reasons why an area like Cambridge has grown so much. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But first, let's just remember that with the next slide, that when we look at Bill Hewlett's garage, Paching, there it is, just as a reminder. Actually, Paching, it's an epicenter. And what happens, as Nicky Kaldor, who got the Nobel Prize in the 50s for pointing out, you get this agglomeration of advantage. You get accumulated advantage, agglomeration economics. Once Cambridge had got monoclonal antibodies, once Cambridge had got Crick and Watson, then people came to Cambridge because that was where you were going to do monoclonal antibodies, where you were going to do all those kinds of bits of research. And the end result of that long chain of things is that Cambridge has produced the highest selling drug there has ever been in the history of the world. It's a drug called Humira, and it's changed its name now, but it grosses something like $20 billion a year, right? Now, that kind of process is something which we also need to understand, where we might touch, George, on regulation and why that's important. But in my own sphere, which is telecoms, The deregulation in Sweden and Finland meant that they were prepared when the mobile phone revolution came along to take the lead in that. And they were hugely advanced in terms of, particularly Sweden, in terms of using telecommunications and their mobile phones. And the Finns got a lucky break, which was caused partly by the collapse of the Soviet Union. But let's not go into that detail. But for us, for the United Kingdom, for several years, because of the deregulation that we brought in place, and because the initiatives that were shown, we had for a while the world's largest mobile phone company, Vodafone. And for a very long time, actually, and certainly in modern terms, Vodafone was the largest mobile phone company. And that epicenter effect, the first mover advantage, doing something in an area has a long-lasting impact, as we saw with the Industrial Revolution. As you know, the long-term effects of Manchester and Birmingham being at the forefront of that went on for more than a century. Now, in modern terms, in the 21st century, we can see those kinds of epicenters developing. We can see that accumulated agglomeration economics developing. And one of the good examples of that is where I live, and that's Cambridge. Let's have a look at the next slide. So, Andy, I think he's on the call. I always acknowledge you when I come to make this quote. Cambridge is a low-risk place to do high-risk things. Paching. Let's look at the list of some of the companies in Cambridge. Now, there are a lot of places in the world, never mind in the UK, who would give their eye teeth for a list of companies being present in their city, a list as good as this. And certainly, you would not expect it from a city of 130,000 people. And it's a town and city, 130,000 people, that Paching has generated over $21 billion companies. And as I was saying to somebody just before we started, if the proceeds from the arms sale to SoftBank had been distributed to every man, woman and child in Cambridge, each of them would have received £200,000. I'm getting my orders of magnitude wrong at the moment. Right, so let's look at the next point, Paching. The world's top university and research laboratories and technical consultancies, but that's a self-generating thing. Once you get, like Stanford, a good university, or like Berkeley, you get good universities, then people are attracted, they come out, they found lots of companies, they add to the aura, they add to the ecosystem. It's a standard, I suppose, exponential growth process, as Caldor identified in the 50s. Paching. We've got a lot of homegrown biotech, high-tech and engineering companies, but that's because of the way in which the system works. And it's a bit odd for Treasury when they look at Cambridge, because normally Treasury expect an area in the UK to be attracting inward investment. In fact, although we have lots of inward investment, Amazon, for example, down Station Road employs 450 people. And they're doing all their drone development, for example, in Cambridge. That is not actually typical. What is really typical of what's going on are the homegrown companies like ARM or like Abcam, indeed. Paching. We have those multinationals because they're attracted to that system, Paching. And then we have angel and VC investors, and particularly the angel investors who are recycling the money that they've made. I made more investments than I care to admit, even to myself. And I helped formed a thing called Cambridge Angels, and some of the Cambridge Angels are on this call. It's very important for a cluster to have that kind of infrastructure. And we're very lucky with some very enlightened and very good VC investors these days in Cambridge. Paching. And then the most important for me is the networking and mentoring organizations. Now, the angels are somewhat like that. Angels do a lot of mentoring. The point about angels is get them involved in the company, they help you move along. But it's that networking and mentoring, places, things like Cambridge Wireless and Cambridge Network, as I say, what goes on with Cambridgeshire Head, although I haven't listed them here, networking in order to understand the strategy for the future of Cambridge. Those networking and mentoring organisations are the thing that mobilises resources for people and makes Cambridge a low-risk place to do high-risk things. Next slide. Now, place matters. And I'm going to illustrate this with one graph. And the graph is the notion of forming bringing an accelerator into an area. And this is some work that was done by Nesta, looking at accelerators in different regions in the United Kingdom. Now, an accelerator is usually a building, and it houses startup companies and provides mentoring and other kinds of facilities for those startup companies in order to get them off the ground. And generally, an accelerator will give them particularly access to sources of capital. They have to get that capital themselves. It's not doshed out to them, but that's roughly what happens. And the mentoring enables them to grow. Now, what's important about this graph is if we look at, and then we, my internet connection apparently is unstable. Have we got, oh, right, fine, sorry. Yeah, I just had the lights dim in my house, so it may be that I just lost, connectivity for a moment. Start the accelerator there. And then about 2 years after the, formation of the accelerator, you see something different, paching. The investment in the area not related to the accelerator goes up. Now, a number of hypotheses that you could advance for why this happens. But when you look at the research from Nesta, it's clear there's a strong networking effect. And there are various other effects as well, which I want to talk about, which we'll get to with the next slide. So there are 12 things which make clusters work. Number one, a strong pool of founders. So you've got a bunch of people who, as you had up in Seattle, up in Seattle with Gates and other people, or you have down in San Francisco, a bunch of people who found companies. Number two, you have local capital, which enables you to mobilize the resources. Number three, you've got killer events. When we started Cambridge Network, it was Herman Hauser who brought in his mates from around the world, but primarily from the West Coast. And we had killer events. They were attended by hundreds of people because and they made a huge difference to people's aspirations and how they thought about the various opportunities that were in front of them. Number four is access to great universities. Now, the North is not short of great universities. Look at Manchester, for example. Number five, motivated champions. The North is not short of some motivated champions. Howard Bernstein, for example, up in Manchester, again, has made a huge difference. Number six, the local press, websites and networks. You need to make sure that they are mobilized. Number seven, you want alumni. You want people who've been through the area, probably gone elsewhere, hopefully have come back. Number eight, you want some very clear local wins that you can demonstrate to people that there is something going on. Number nine, you recycle your capital. People make money, they recycle it. Certainly what's happened in Cambridge. And that's what happened in Silicon Valley. If you went there in the 1950s, there wasn't that much recycled capital, but people started to make money and they started to recycle. And that's what drove the fantastic growth through the 60s and 70s. Number 10 is second-time entrepreneurs. 20 years ago in Cambridge, people who were entrepreneurs for the first time. 20 years later, we're seeing second and third-time entrepreneurs pitching to do things. Number 11 would be an ability to attract a pool of talent. I'd say, honestly, Cambridge is a pretty flat place. There are some much nicer landscapes and stuff going on further north, but we'll talk about that. But a pool of talent also wants to go where there's a a great deal of stuff already going on. So that's a bit of a difficulty, unless you're in the Northern Quarter in Manchester. There's a lot going on there. And number 12, marquee local companies. So what you want is companies that will attract people, will spin out people, and will have an obvious general presence in the marketplace that people can identify. So, for example, Sage up in the northeast. So, I want to conclude. I have to conclude by past, so I'm just about on time. So let's look at the next slide, because building tech clusters requires a different kind of investment. And I know I've got some questions about the creation of transport infrastructure and various other things that need to be done. One of my favourite pictures of Cambridge is a picture of Welcome to Cambridge doing surprisingly well despite its infrastructure. And George's point about the work that I did about with others, it's not me, it's a lot of other people do this work, about on the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Review, was indeed directed at trying to improve that infrastructure. But it will require some different investment. We need to have a different mindset about how we go about doing this. So first of all, place matters. Place really, really matters. You need to have a strong identification with the place. The place is your brand. You need to be able to, and we saw it with the accelerator investment, because in a place, it's much easier to network. It's more difficult to network with other people across a big geography. Number 2 is social capital. By that, I mean, you need to have people trained up. You need to have people with ambition. And you need to lift people's eyes to the horizon so they can see what to do. And I'm going to give you 2 anecdotes on this. One, it's not only up in the northeast that I've done some work on regional regeneration. I did some work with the Irish government on various projects. And whilst I was told by the people at Trinity College Dublin that they decided that they needed to have a computer science course and that they needed to invest in the digital future. And the first course that they ran, which had 32 or something people on it, every single one of them left Ireland. You need to throw enough at this to be able to have enough social capital that will stick. If you go to Dublin now, there's a thriving tech sector. That investment needs to be made in those people. But the other one is a rather sadder story about a meeting at a party in Goole, and just outside Hull. And it pains me to say this. I met the guy who was running the AV. Was I had tattoos and he had ear piercings and all sorts of stuff, but he was an interesting chap, and I had a good chat with him. He'd been a garage mechanic, and he'd gone to Kingston University in Hull to learn music technology, and the course had been absolute rubbish. So he finished after a year, and now he couldn't get back to the garage because he stepped off that particular track. And he was now really at a loose end. He was, to be frank, getting cash in hand for doing this party stuff, and was probably claiming stuff off the dole. I mean, it's just a disaster. So I talked to him about what he was doing, and he got mates from the course, and I suggested that he get together with these mates, and maybe they could find a place for a weekend, and then they could practice and they could teach each other a few things, which I'll talk about in a second. But the light dimmed in his eyes, because he had never had anybody talk to him about how he could take his own destiny in his hands and do something and learn from his mates. Let's go to number 3. And it's peer learning. That we take a lot of clues from our peers. We take a lot of clues from other people. Some of the stuff that I've done with the Centre for Science and Policy, and that I'm doing at the Royal Academy of Engineering, with getting academics and engineers to talk to policymakers. It's about peer learning. The academics learn from the policymakers learn from the academics. It's very important. You need those role models from your peers. And in order to do that, number 4 is you need to connect people. We need to really think about not the of course, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is important, but how are we connecting people in order to be able to make this work? How are we learning from the lunar societies of the 1700s? And to make that happen, we need a fifth point, which is we need champions. We need those champions who will see this and will act as leaders. And then sixthly, we need to devolve the decisions and the funds. Cambridge Wireless, which is something which I help sort out, is a networking organization for promoting mobile communications based in Cambridge, although it has a slightly wider function than that. What it does is it devolves everything within that organization to people who have energy and want to organize events. It organizes the events for them, but it dissolves a lot of the decisions to the members. As a result, it thrives. And we need to understand how to do that devolution appropriately. And in order to do all of that, finally, we need a strategic vision. We need to make sure that we understand that it is entirely possible to regenerate these regions. It is not good enough to give up on these people. It is not good enough to think that actually just something as simple as HS2 is going to really make a difference. Because in the end, it's about this networking and it's about social capital. So the final slide is a picture from Birmingham. And it's William Bloy's statue of Bolton, Watt and Murdoch. And I'm reminded of Jonathan Ruffer's point, which he made in an earlier Big Tent talk, where he talked about Stevenson asking to be given the chance to build a steam engine to make a railway engine. That was what was happening in the North. That is what drove the Industrial Revolution. We need to remember that it's the connections between people that make this happen. And we need to understand that that needs to be at the heart of our policy, not an extra add-on or a nice to have. Thank you.
David, brilliant. Wow, what a great talk, and bang on time as well. So folks, questions please in the chat, and I will do my best to collate them. I've got a load to kick off with, but David, Chairman's prerogative, I wanted to play back a couple of thoughts and ask to myself, which I know are on people's minds. Very struck by, I just want to sort of flag for everyone, the focus tonight, we really want to ask, given what David's just shared with us about the real Cambridge story, the Silicon Valley story, the essay question really is, as government shovels, I think we're now at 110 billion into levelling up, can we actually create clusters? Can a benign and well-intended government actually help to create self-sustaining clusters? So there are two or three thoughts, David. Your point about hippies I thought was brilliant, because in a more sort of civil servant-y slide, that would probably be called culture. It's an important point, actually. The culture was questioning, it was anti-establishment, it was questing, and that culture does shape. And I think there's something very interesting about the role of culture. Places like Aldborough were very poor in the 1910s, turn of the century. That was where artists went because they couldn't afford London. Now, you can't buy a house for love nor money anywhere near Aldborough now because it's full of successful artists from London and others who want to be there. So there's a very interesting thing about culture and arts in driving regeneration and changing thinking. I wanted to ask three specifics. Anchor companies.
Yep.
A cluster need an anchor company or not? And I asked that particularly because quite a lot of the regional development industrial thinking over the last 30 years in Britain has been, you've got to have a Nissan in Sunderland, you've got to have a Rolls Royce. Is that true, really? Secondly, place, as you know, I'm a big advocate of place. It strikes me that because Britain's quite a small country, and Jonathan Ruffer's a good example of this, you can have somebody who makes their money in the City of London, as Jonathan did, and spends it in County Durham. Now, in America, that would be a small bit of one state. And we think of them as oceans apart. But actually, question, is Britain so small that actually today's hugely successful elites can make their money in London and then very happily go to a left behind place and make change happen? And then thirdly, I couldn't let DARPA go. So we have this idea of government to back a huge UK version of DARPA, the Defence and Research Agency in the US. And I have some concerns because I think a lot of the US tech success was driven by defence, Pentagon, Cold War, massive budgets.
Yep.
I worry that if we think we're just going to recreate that, we're going to end up creating a sort of space shuttle with no fuel. But yet I also do think that we've tinkered in Britain in science for years, and we don't properly back our hunches, we don't properly back winners, and we've let great things go. So there we are. I'm interested in particularly your reflections on anchor companies, DARPA, and whether a new generation of angels might allow us to reach out across the country in a way that we sometimes overlook.
Right. Well, George, 3 really interesting questions, and we could talk about these 3 for all the time that we've got remaining. I'll try and keep it short. I worry about anchor companies. And I worry about anchor companies because anchor companies are large compared to the ecosystem that they then inhabit. You plonk a big company down, and all you're doing is creating a kind of client-servant, a servant-master relationship, because people will then get employed by that big company, and that's what they think of. And you can see that in some respects. If you go to Sophia Antipolis down in the south of France, Sophia Antipolis has originally attracted IBM's research laboratory after they got turned down by Cambridge. Cambridge refused to have IBM's research laboratory in the 1960s because they didn't want the beautiful town of Cambridge polluted by these nasty techno people. They went down to Sophia Antipolis, and it's a nice place. You can get up to go skiing if you want. You can bathe in the Mediterranean, but actually it's pretty soulless. It lacks the messiness, the cultural thing of the hippies. I mean, Cambridge, on the other hand, and Silicon Valley to a great extent, if you look at the way it works, is very messy. It's very messy, and I think that the anchor companies aren't necessarily the best way to approach that. And just as important, I suspect, that the thinking that an anchor company is then the answer to something, that Nissan is the answer to the problems of the Northeast, is not thinking this through, because it's the web, it's the network, it's how does the ecosystem actually function, and just putting an elephant down there just doesn't cut it for me. So that's that point. About the small country, yes, we are a very small country. We are absolutely tiny. I mean, even on a bad day, I can get to Manchester in less than 4 hours, which is, you try driving across even California at, I completely believe it. But you have to have the opportunities. If somebody wants to go and invest, they need to have the opportunities to invest. Now, they can invest on the basis of, culture, as you talked about with Aldborough, or they can create the culture. They can save culture, as Jonathan did. But we need to be thinking about how are we creating just the tiny seeds. We don't need to do huge things, just the tiny seeds that will enable that exponential process to gain hold. And think about it, as I said about my point number 7, strategic vision. This needs to be thought about in terms of decades. Silicon Valley, go from 1938, right? Don't expect this stuff to happen overnight. It won't, right? But we have got opportunities out there, and there would be some things that we could do at a small scale that could then grow much bigger. And I think that in there lies the clue to how to make that work. And then finally, the DARPA thing. Well, my first encounter with ARPA was 1970, end of 77, I think. And I sat in a meeting with a mad UCL professor who wanted to break up communications into little packets with the help of these mad people from across the United States, where they wanted to put them on a satellite link and then actually have voice communications over packet. And my head of division turned to me and said, do you think we should fund this? And it was about, I think it was £100,000 or £120,000, a lot of money in those days. And I turned to Jim and I said, Jim, yes, we should fund this because someday all information will go by packet. Now, the thing was about the ARPA or the DARPA initiative was that they were spending money on defense. They were spending an awful lot. They went into partnership with other people, but they also had really clever people who actually understood. Eventually I got to meet Vince Cerf and all those other people in the 90s and understood what I had just accidentally tiptoed into in the late 1970s. This stuff happens over decades. That's 20 years in the making to go from that experiment to the real birth of the internet. And we need that kind of scale of thinking. But actually, the ARPA proposals that we've got for the United Kingdom at 800 million, as Dan Korski points out today in the paper, is far too small. It actually needs to be at least 10 times bigger than that.
Brilliant. David, thank you. Tons of questions. I'm going to call people, if you can be ready to unmute. Sabah has got a great question about skills and connectivity. John O'Halloran on finance and how you kind of create those financial feedback loops, and Siobhan from LiftShare on how you really make these things locally led, thinking differently. So Sabah.
So my question was around, well, with the emergence of 5G, can we then help promote the levelling up agenda and then have whole clusters of cottage industries? If we upskill the population, surely that is one way to go without having the need to have these big anchor companies that just consume all the local resources and the workforce, etc. So just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, Sabah, I think it's extremely important. I'm going to feel very old because I'm now telling anecdotes from way, way back. But back in 1987, I was co-author on a report which said that what we needed was a optical fibre broadband infrastructure across the whole of the UK. And for every house and every office block and every premise to be connected using optical fibre. We still haven't got there. And I think that is an absolute tragic strategic error on behalf of successive governments, right? Now, optical fiber, 5G, I don't really care, but what I want is at least 100 megabits per second. And I really would like a gigabit per second available to me. Now, the reason, when I once said this, where was I? I was in Brussels, and there was somebody from the DTI who came up to me afterwards and said, there is absolutely no reason why anybody, and I was talking about 10 megabits a second or 100 megabits a second, why anybody would ever want that kind of level of connectivity, right? I go back to the ARPA point, the DARPA point, and some of the stuff I was talking about in those 12 points about what makes clusters, it's what makes a country great as well. We have vision, right? We should have, I wish we had done in the 1980s and the 1990s, invested in that infrastructure. We would be in a rather different place. Fortunately, we invested enough of it so that when COVID hit, we could do things like this, right? And the engineers and technologists who put that together deserve much higher praise than they get. But there's still a lot to do. And your point about 5G and the flexibility that 5G gives us is very important. It will be incredibly important over the next, and we need to be at the forefront of this. We cannot be in the second division.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I'm going to take the next two in a pair, if I can, David. Jono.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks, George, and great talk, David. So my question is how do we stimulate local funding as you're starting a cluster? We're based up in Newcastle upon Tyne, trying to get a biotech diagnostics cluster going. We've been here for about 8 years and still have been struggling to get adequate funding or adequate and timely funding. I've really struggled to get along. And now I fully understand how once you get to the second generation of entrepreneurs that it's, they will reinvest. But how do you get that initial that spark, considering there's a cluster in Cambridge just 3 hours down the road, and all VCs question, why are you in Newcastle? You can't be serious.
Yeah, well, that's the other side of George's point about this being a small island, because if you're only 3 hours away, you're not quite commuting distance, but the effect is very strong. And in a place like the United States, you can have the Research Triangle over in Raleigh, which does biotech. You can do the stuff up in Boston, or you can do the stuff up in San Francisco, and they are sufficiently far apart to have their own identity. So I think that is quite a serious problem. And I think the way to get around that, I mean, and to be honest with you, Jonathan, to be able to answer this question properly, you need to know much more about the circumstances that you're talking about. So forgive me if I don't hit particular nails on the head. I would have to know much more. The second one is, it's the distinctive brand and the contribution. You need to be thinking about what it is that makes what you're doing distinct from a place like Oxford or Bristol or Cambridge or Manchester or wherever it is. And then the third one is something which is much more general as far as government is concerned. You know, we have massive procurement from government, in particular from the NHS. And we really ought to be, as a matter of government policy, trying to procure more from these startups. Now, you've seen, and Andy Richards, who may still be on the call, I don't know, we'll talk about how the pharmaceutical companies have shifted from being entirely self-contained to try and open up and do open innovation, and looking for promising places where this stuff, where they can then, like BioNTech or like the work they've done with Oxford or those kinds of things, because they can't do the innovation inside themselves. So there is some hope in there, but you need to find what's distinctive. And if I just have a small word, you talked about diagnostics. Diagnostics is a very, very stony, rocky path, and I would say, we don't have enough time here for me to explain by anecdote or anything else why diagnostics is really very, very difficult area to get into. But assured, take me from me, it is. And then I'll be just like the guy who taught me engineering design at university, who said, look at the wheelbarrow, it's perfect, there's nothing very much you can do to improve on the wheelbarrow. And then James Dyson came along and put a ball on the front of it and changed the way in which we thought about wheelbarrows. Nobody remembers that because you're all too young. But so don't take my word about diagnostics, but it is a very difficult road to go down.
I can't help coming in on that, because I think diagnostics is changing fast. It used to be a boring black box business, and it's becoming the front end of the new patient pathway. But that's another conversation. I'd love to be an investor.
But you see, you've got there, George. You've got exactly the problem. We need a systems view of how this works, right? Back to the Health Resilience Commission. We need a systems view of how this works. We need government to understand that. We need the right strategic and regulatory framework, and then places like Newcastle can take off.
Totally agree. I'm doing what I can. I can't help but share a story with you. When back in the day when I was Minister for Life Science, David Pryor, Lord Pryor, said, George, I'm thinking of having a round table here of all the leaders of the academic health science centres. What do you think? I said, no, I think that's a terrible idea, because they'll come in here in 45 minutes, just tell you what they want you to hear. Why don't we go and see one and kick the tyres? And he okay. I said, let's go to Cambridge, because I know where the tyres are. We had a meeting in Cambridge, and there was a huge NHS innovation bureaucracy, and there was one company, because I'd insisted that there was a company that had done some work with the Academic Health Science Centre. And it was a company that had designed an innovative way of treating leg ulcers, which is, a major course of...
Oh, this is the oxygen flow stuff. Yeah, they were funded by Cambridge Angels.
Yeah. So we had this huge conversation. I said, look, what I want to do is create a situation where the East Anglian NHS, Addenbrooke's, actually buys some innovation from East Anglian tech companies. So here's one. And he was very self-effacing, like good entrepreneurs are. Could hardly get a word in edgeways for all the bureaucracy. And eventually I said, no, guys, hang on. I think if you ask this guy, he would probably give you a batch of 30,000 of these free of charge, as long as he got the data on whether they work or not. And he looked at me and went, I said, probably he'd give you 2 years supply at heavy discount so that he can say used in the NHS. And he went, and it was completely lost on this professional NHS innovation community that preferred to talk about innovation rather than actually just pick up the phone and get something.
Look, George, you're talking about culture change here. This is the point. It's about people. It's about culture change. We need to change the attitude. We need to change the way in which this stuff works. Look, I was on the board of the Ministry of Defence for about 8 years. And we, just prior to my joining, we'd invited a bunch of Russians across the end of the Soviet Union to see how we did procurement. And we showed them how we did our wonderful procurement. And they said, yes, but that's exactly the same as we do in the Soviet Union. And it's exactly the same. If you have the same incentive structure and you have the same way of putting in a bureaucracy, you will get the same results. We need to change the way in which we're doing it. And that's why DARPA is so important, because it had a radically different way of thinking about how it organized things. And I can point at Cambridge companies. There's my neighbor across the road. I can almost see his house from my window, who actually his own company benefited hugely from them not investing, but buying product.
Yeah. Okay, there's a few questions about...
there's the one about locally led.
Yeah, that's Siobhan.
Hi. Yes, David, thank you ever so much. Really inspiring. I think one of the things which is great just about your talk, you probably answered it, is your energy. And I think that's perhaps what we lack as a trigger. And I'm here and I'm in Norfolk and Suffolk now, and I'm wondering, why can't we find the glue to bring the energetic sparks that are here? You know, you've talked a lot about this model this evening, and your 7 points have probably answered what the formula is. But how do we create that soul? We've got Think Norwich in Norwich, which is this, amazing, innovative network of people, but we're still acting in silos. You said about inspiration, about telling people to take their destiny in their own hands. Well, how do we ignite that and, and bring all these brains together and fund them as well, so we can be, the true entrepreneurs, which I believe is in many of our souls?
Well, part of that was where I said about Herman's role in this stuff. So when we formed Cambridge Network, we were a little bit excited. We didn't really know what to do.
Yeah.
What Herman did was he brought in these demigods who landed from Silicon Valley, and we went, wow, is that how it works? Is that what we do? Now, I don't want to cast the people in Cambridge or Oxford or whatever is, or in Silicon Roundabout as demigods, but we need to share this stuff.
Yeah,
we need to. I did a presentation very similar to this in some respects in Wales, in what must be 6-7 years ago now, 8 years ago. And I talked in very similar terms, and there was enthusiasm, but there wasn't the real follow-up. But everywhere you go, there's this hunger to do this stuff. Human beings, they want to do things. You just need to give them the opportunity to do it, and give them the role models, give them show them where this stuff goes. And create structures that are not, as George was saying, not bureaucratic, but free people up to do this stuff.
Maybe even a festival.
People will do amazing things.
Yeah.
Brilliant. David, I'm going to take, because we've got so many questions, can I group 3 questions and then one answer? These are all on aspiration and how we really connect with those people who have been genuinely left behind. Sally, John Beer and Joe Zammit. Sally.
Sally, you need to come off mute.
Talking away at you through the screen. Nice to see you, David. And that was really, it's a great package, actually. I think the additional question that quite a few of us in various ways on this chat are asking is, how does the benefit of the cluster go beyond those who are thriving in the cluster, really? So how do we make sure that it's beyond the people who've really benefited and are part of it? And I think that's the same in Silicon Valley, by the way, as it is here. I mean, it's probably worse. Yeah.
John, you've got a particular thing on rural, picking up perhaps the point earlier about heroin in Chatteris.
Me or the other John?
John Beer. Yeah, John.
Okay. It's around children in rural regions have this ambition and talent and why just as much as cities. And how can cities such as Cambridge take the lead in creating rural and coastal powerhouses? Because, you know, spread the love, right? You know, I live 2 stops down the line from Cambridge, and, you know, we get nothing out there other than people that live there to go to Cambridge.
Yeah.
Great. And finally, Joe, similar theme on how we really connect to left behind areas.
Yes, I think what I was asking actually was asked by Sally. But if you look at the Bay Area in California, it's got among the highest, it's the highest, most unequal area in California. And the unskilled income is falling. So I'm just conscious that we don't look at regeneration with elitist eyes, that it's okay to do things for people like us, but not for people left behind. The only other thing I would say is if anybody's up for setting up a hippie colony in Newcastle, I'm in.
David, there you go.
Okay, so I think those 3 things, as you've just passed them, George, are very closely linked. I mean, it's what do you do to, you know, it's all very well to celebrate a success, for example, in Cambridge, but 4 kilometres away from where I'm sitting, the life expectancy drops by 12 years. This is not anything a civilized society should really tolerate. And I think that the point, you know, John, you were making about, you know, it's a little bit like that point I was making about the anchor companies. You know, it doesn't necessarily solve the specific problem for the place, because if you've got, you know, a magnet like Cambridge and everybody simply commutes in and goes back, and that becomes just a kind of slightly wasted suburb, that's not good enough. And I think the connecting to those left behind people, as Joe you pointed out, is being asked by those other points. So let's try and tackle this one. I think that we can't. I mean, those of you who don't know the geography of Cambridge won't understand when I refer to Wisbech, or we've just referred to Chatteris as places. Although Chatteris has got the company that produces more than 50% of all the what are they called? What are those things you slide into when they're trying to identify cancer? What somebody tell me.
MRI scans.
Yes. So over half the world's MRI scanners come from Chatteris, right? Now you're not going to you've got to understand. And I've been to the factory, and I've been there, and I've talked to them about how to integrate them and network them with Cambridge. So we're not without some way of dealing with this. But Wisbech is a better example. Wisbech used to be a prosperous town. You can see it. But it's been completely left behind, and it was a problem for the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Review about how do we do this, how do we ignite those things, and part of that was done with a paper that Andy Neely and I wrote. Andy Neely's the Pro Vice Chancellor for Business Relations at Cambridge, about innovation districts, about how you start to do things, and you pick stuff, for example, agriculture, where you could start to do some more interesting kind of research, more interesting tech development, and so on in that. But the benefit, I think, you know, I do not want us to keep on going down this road of busing people from place to place and then getting eggs thrown at the buses. You know, this kind of division doesn't work, and it's not good for society. It's not good on ethical and moral principles. It's not good on security principles, for heaven's sake, and it's a huge waste of human talent. So I think actually we need to do things like, so one of the things that I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but one of the things that I've been involved in is setting up the Cambridge Science Centre. The Cambridge Science Centre is a outreach organisation with the Science Centre attached to it. What we do in non-COVID times is go out to places like King's Lynn and Wisbech and do those things. And when you analyse the people that we're reaching, we are actually reaching, when you analyze the postcodes of where these people come from, we're actually over proportionally represented in the bottom 25% of the socio-demographics. We are actually doing stuff like that, and we need more things like that, because in the Cambridge Science Centre stuff that we've done, it's tackling that 7 to 11-year-old kids who actually will, like I did when I went to the Science Museum, have a major impression about what science is and what engineering is, and then perhaps take that up in the long run and lift their eyes above the horizon. The same thing happened. Sorry, George, I know you're trying to be a chairman, but I'd say the same thing with Raspberry Pi. The same, you know, in Raspberry Pi, we reach underprivileged, the kids who have free school meals and those kinds of things are overrepresented by the code clubs that we do with Raspberry Pi. That's the stuff that we need to do.
David, just on that point about the culture change, and Siobhan's point in Norfolk, through the Norfolk Way, we set up the Norfolk Innovation Awards just to try and change the culture of how young people think about their county. When you go around schools, as I do as a constituency MP, and you ask primary school children, describe Norfolk, they describe a place that's kind of, at best, Burnham Market, Gold Range Rovers on Sea, or sort of Turnip Townsend. They don't say the Sainsbury Laboratory or the John Innes or the Norwich Research Park. So we have the Norfolk Innovation Awards, and we have the best CBE Science Prize, the best school technician, the best comprehensive science teacher. And do you know, people, we got everything sponsored. 700 people came to the awards. Proud parents, because children, and we nominated, you know, and actually that cultural connection was just trying to make people think of Norfolk as an innovation county.
Exactly, George. That's the kind of, now that stuff needs to go on in all sorts of areas. You know, one thing like that, one thing like the Science Centre, one thing like Raspberry Pi, one thing like that Norfolk Awards doesn't cut it. But if we do that on an extended front in a specific area, then you start to make the difference.
Well, that's partly what we're thinking the Big Tent can help with, because it must be politically neutral, and it must be somewhere passionate about good conversation and the authenticity of place, and not coming out of any political party. So next bunch of questions. By the way, folks, David, he's offered to stay till 7:30, which is incredibly kind, David, an hour and a half. What I'm suggesting is I formally close at 7:15, and then it's free for all, and you can all ask David what you want, and he can do it as he likes, and I'll get out of the way. So 12 more minutes of me. There were some really interesting questions bunching, David, about connectivity. Simon from eWay and Tony Nerdberg had asked about the Northeast, and one of our previous Big Tent events was on, you know, is there something we could do fast rail, HS3 or 4, if you like, Glasgow to Edinburgh to Newcastle, linking the Scottish cluster corridor with the Northeast. And then Simon Robeson's got an interesting question about cycle distance, and John Goddard about the plethora of top-down initiatives that leave the place just as disconnected as before. So, Simon, are you there?
One.
Simon Robeson.
Simon Robeson, yeah.
Come in, Simon.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, David, and thank you, George. Yeah, it's a bit of a sort of academic point probably, but someone once told me that key to forming clusters was the so-called, which is a sort of a Cambridge thing, I suspect, the cycle distance. You're trying to, clusters are typically made up of lots of bright young things doing entrepreneurial stuff, and they quite like to be within a cycle distance of where they live. It's not like a science park where, us old farts will get in a car and drive an hour. This is different. It's a cultural point really that I'm trying to get at, and just, and if that is true, well, how does that leave us in the Northeast?
And David, sorry, last one on this theme, John Goddard and Paul Goldsmith. John? That might have been a posted question. Paul Goldsmith?
Yeah, I mean, it's an observation that this is a fantastic meeting where we've got people from all over the UK, but also overseas. And I don't think this would have happened before lockdown in the Meet the Leaders events, which we had in London, which were great. but there's still a barrier in terms of distance. So there's this opportunity to really provide outreach from places such as Cambridge or anywhere in the country. So how can we take it to the next level?
There you go, David. So cycle distance and connectivity.
Okay. And a bit about physical infrastructure, because I think that's important, HS3, the Northeast. Now, I think we're in the middle of, some of you may have heard me rant on at an earlier meeting about the Cambridge Autonomous Metro and what we've been trying to do in Cambridge with rethinking kind of regional transport systems. I mean, I'm not a transport economist or engineer by any means, but having got involved in that, it strikes me that we're in the middle of something of a transport revolution, both with the ability for autonomous vehicles, the ability to have smaller scale systems which are then integrated so that you can actually guarantee, instead of 3.5 hours, you could actually guarantee an hour and a quarter end to end or whatever it is, without necessarily having the bullet train, without necessarily having all that massive investment, because you can actually do a lot of these transport systems much more cheaply. And particularly if you start to base it around some of the kind of the mass production that Tesla and others are doing with autonomous vehicles, I think we could find ourselves with a very different kind of way of thinking about transport. And bicycles, but electric bikes, actually, are a very important part of that mix. I had the pleasure of cycling an a rather powerful electric bike, to be honest, up some hills about 2 weeks ago, for reasons which were entirely COVID compliant, so don't worry about that. I was just absolutely amazed at what it did to my feeling of how far I could go on a bicycle. And I think there are some things happening in transport technology which not quite as big as the replacement, of the horse with the car or the steam train of the carriage, but are getting to be pretty substantial. And I think in terms of strategy for places like the Northeast, there are obviously some big articulation points that you need to put in, but actually you need to be thinking about how you develop that ability so that people don't get in their car for that 2-mile trip. It's not what you want to do. Okay, quite apart from anything else, when I'm on my bicycle in Cambridge, I bump into people, which is always nice. The point about taking this to the next level, Paul, and what we do there. I draw on some experience that I've had with, formerly Cambridge Network and Cambridge Wireless, there's Cambridge Angels, Cambridge Ahead. And I did a thing called the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge, and I'm doing a similar thing at the moment at the Royal Academy of Engineering. And I want to just focus on those things there, because I think they're really important as insight into how this stuff works, because they are the lunar societies turned into something for the 21st century. And the way this, so forgive me, but I'm going to describe a little bit about how this stuff works. So about 12 years ago, I was asked by the University of Cambridge to set up a kind of mechanism or an institute for connecting academics and policymakers so that we would get policymakers to understand much more about what academics did. And of course, that was the way it was phrased. As you probably noticed, I'm rather strong on this peer-to-peer thing, everybody being equal, showing mutual respect. I think the academics have as much to learn from the policymakers as the policymakers do from the academics. And I approached that on the basis of the networking that I've talked about, which was to say, most important thing is for people to meet other people. So the whole system was predicated on a policy fellow being given 30 people to meet, spending an hour with each of them, finding out some really interesting and different things, stuff that they'd never expected to do, and then going back to Whitehall, equipped with a new network. And the new basis for, I don't know the answer to that, but I think I know somebody who might know, or who would know the person who knew. The scale of that in Cambridge now is 1,500 academics and other experts, and a number of people on these calls actually will have participated in that program, and about 450 of these policy fellows, and well over 11,000 meetings. It might be 12,000 meetings now between them. So if you go to Whitehall and you scratch anywhere, actually most of those people will know or have been involved in that network. And it has connected Cambridge into Whitehall and Whitehall into Cambridge in a way that, frankly, no other university in the United Kingdom has. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit of that is actually we now have a free flow of discussion and ideas between Whitehall and Cambridge. And I talk about Cambridge. Do you know what? We've involved Oxford, we've involved UCL and King's, we've involved Southampton, we've involved Bath. I've helped set up the same thing in Bath. I've done all these various bits and pieces around the country. And I'm doing the same thing with the Royal Academy of Engineering, trying to get engineering embedded into policy making. Now, why is this important? It's important because it's exactly, I think, I'm sure I'm a man with a hammer seeing nails everywhere, but look, I think it's the same thing. We need that kind of policy fellows network, a kind of way of creating lunar societies for the 21st century, the way of networking people together so that we can exchange these ideas, we can get this understanding. You know, I can't come up to Newcastle at the moment and go and see the biotech centre there. But boy, you know, it's exactly, George, as you were pointing out, that's what you need to do. You need to talk directly to people. Don't talk to, you know, the abstract organizations or the memoranda of understanding between two great corporate blocks. That's not what's going on. What's going on is the people on this call. It's the people networking together that makes it work. And we need to actually put in place the structure for that so that it doesn't just happen because we're people of goodwill. It happens because there's actually a framework to make it happen.
Thank you, David. Bad news is I've had various messages from people saying a Zoom without a chair is hopeless. So George, please stay. I don't think that's a tribute to my chairing. It just so I'm going to stay with us till 7:30.
You could call yourself Jackie Weaver, George.
I just share a story with you there about connectivity. 2 or 3 events that have most shaped my thinking about cluster connectivity are from my good friend Andy Richards, who is somewhere on this call. And I remember Andy's quote, actually, correct me if I've got this wrong, Andy, is, David, your original, that a cluster is a low-risk place to move your family to pursue a high-risked career. It's an interesting point, that, because it needs to be somewhere you can persuade your partner to take the children, because the schools are okay and it's a nice place to breathe. But also I remember with Andy, when we were working very closely on Cambridge companies, driving to an event in Oxford. And I assumed that Andy, as a leading UK bio angel, was forever going to Oxford. And we got lost somewhere between Bedford, Buckingham, Bicester, or one of those Bs. I said to Andy, well, don't you come here all the time? He said, no, I never come. It's just such a nightmare journey. Well, when it's such a nightmare journey to go from Oxford to Cambridge, for Andy Richards to go, we got a problem as a country. My proudest moment was getting the East-West Railway route agreed. And then I remember Andy saying to me, George, there's some brilliant, when I became an M candidate in Norfolk, brilliant technology in the Norwich Research Park, particularly in food and agri, and some brilliant medicine, but I just can't do it. It takes me, it's unreliable. It takes 2.5 hours to get there. And as an angel, I want to be at the school gate by 3:30. You're going to have to do it. If it takes 2.5 hours to drive down the A11 from Cambridge to Norwich, you're never going to build a cluster. So I just share those thoughts with you. Anyway, questions. Alex Plant has got a great question about devolution of finance and kind of back to that Heseltine report, No Stone Unturned, that don't we really have to get local financial ownership at the heart of any serious regeneration? And Hannah Davis has got a brilliant question about the North and the South and inequality. And she makes the point that in health, on some metrics, it's the difference between the North and the South is like East and West Germany. And isn't that vital, really, to building modern clusters? So devolved finance. Alex, you there?
Yeah, hi, George. Well, David's heard me wibble on about this for many, many years, so it's a question he knows. But it's a very interesting point that we got on the call. We have Ed Twiddy, we have Mike Emmerich and myself, all ex-Treasury folk, who were probably partly responsible for being a dead hand of centralisation when there. And And then having moved to our various places of Cambridge, Manchester and Durham, we're all trying to argue the opposite. But the reason I particularly bring it to bear here is, David, you talked about Birmingham and Manchester. And if you look at what Chamberlain did in Birmingham, he was able to give the seeds of what became a remarkable growth in Birmingham, similar in Manchester, which underpinned the Industrial Revolution there, through fiscal devolution, through tax increment financing, which actually gave Birmingham the ability to fly in the way that it did in the mid-19th century. And we have no such ability to grow our existing clusters in the UK now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Shall I answer that straight away, George?
Yeah, let's take that because it's a bit different for the next one.
Okay, so Alex, you're right, and what we did, it's a bit like what's happened to the banks. You know, they basically removed all the decision making from the branches. They hollowed the thing out. They offshored stuff. You know, we've lost the point about what actually being local is about. And one of the things somebody was saying to me recently, you know, we used to have county engineers. We used to have people who were local, who understood about this stuff. We used to have, and I was talking to Carol Brain a week or so about how public health has been hollowed out. We'll get on to the health and inequalities in a second. All been hollowed out. All the competencies have gone, you know, and so you can't devolve financial responsibility very easily if what you've done is you've removed the ability of the organizations to actually implement anything. If all they are doing is taking some instruction from central government and ticking the right boxes in order to do something, you're never going to get the creativity and innovation and stuff that you actually need, nor will you get the fiscal responsibility for how you're actually going to do something. Now, part of it is about risk taking, and this terrible thing in government as the SpaceX barreled down and then went boom on the ground. I don't know if you saw it, but it was a fabulous piece of example of engineering. And the commentator that I was listening to said, well, of course, private enterprise can do that because private enterprise can sustain failure. Government cannot have public failure of that kind of scale because it's too embarrassing. And so that fear of failure and this fear of this caution has just pulled everything back to the center so that we control it. And we've lost the ability. I'm with Thucydides. I'm with the Athenians and the Spartans against the Persians, right? I am, you know, that's the way to think about this thing. We need, you know, the Greek city-states were a bunch of troublesome, difficult bunch, right? But actually, it's better and more robust. Cambridge is chaotic and anarchic, but it's actually quite robust because you have that devolution. So that's a very long answer and going back into okay. And then the health inequality. Go on, Hannah.
Thanks. So yeah, it's a point around the scale of the health inequalities between the North and the rest of the UK. So clearly they exist throughout the UK, but we know half the North has worse health than the worst area in the South. So when you're clustering with such inequalities, how do you combat that? So I liked what you're saying about how you go out to various harder to reach places in Cambridgeshire. But when you're talking about the scale of it with the North, I think you're dealing with a very different beast. Yeah. So how do you cluster at that? And also, you know, the North has lots of opportunities, and can you cluster across the North, for example, if you put in place HS3, HS2, so you can live in a low risk environment because you can commute to a number of different cities?
So you're touching on one of the downsides of the HS2 thing, which is actually it gives a privilege the ability to swoop past all the areas of deprivation and not touch them. So you know, I think we need to be very careful about that. You're right to draw. You're right to draw attention to this point that there is this massive. The scale of the problem in the North is much bigger than it is on average in the South. But don't underestimate the degree of pockets of deprivation that we have in the north of Cambridgeshire. I mean, they are as bad, if not They must be as bad. I'd hope never that human beings in the United Kingdom other people didn't live in as bad circumstances, but maybe they do, right? So there is a problem, and one of the reasons for the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Review, we brought Carol Black in, Dame Carol Black in to look after, to specifically deal with health, so that we would have an integrated approach to how economics work. And I'm absolutely sold on the notion that health, economic, social well-being and equality are all inextricably linked. In terms of what you do about it, well, there are a lot of cultural issues. There's a lot of tradition. There's a lot of ways of thinking about things. One of the great, I suppose, if you looked at the archetypal way about thinking about Northerners, you know, they don't take any nonsense, you know, and there is an attitude which you need to engage with and understand, that is a different way of thinking about culture and about the way in which you engage with people, which is different to the way in which people do if you're rich middle class or if you're poor working class. All of that needs to be thought about. And what I'm saying is that there isn't a technological solution to this. It's not a technical fix. I think we've got the technology. It's a systems fix. We need to think about how we encourage those people, like that chap in Goole, you know, crikey, his life expectancy was nothing like mine, right? And it pains me to think that that's happening.
David, also, I think there's something about habits and culture. County Durham is one of the places we're doing some work as a big tent, and it's a county up 20 years ago. I did a ton of work up there on rural deprivation, very strong little pit villages in one county. I would argue that the model of high commuting, car dependence, isolation is a complete aberration to the culture of County Durham. They're used to cycling and taking trains on the old beaching line between communities and having a really strong sense of community. I was doing an oral history up there, and half the people I met have met their partners by going down the train. And actually, I think we should argue that this sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s car economy has partly run against the grain of local culture, and using railway stations and bikes and buses to connect disparate rural areas can be very powerful.
Yeah, so Mike Emmerich will write a book about this, about the influence of the car and how it changed urban life. But Hannah, to get back to your point, I think the answer about this stuff is that there's no general solution. There's no specific thing that if only you did this, you would solve this problem. You know, these are deep-rooted, long-term problems that have occurred ever since we abandoned the notion of the household in the 17th century as the organizing principle, and they outsourced working for wool and those things, and we pulled people into factories and we started to centralize things, and the change that then happened and ran through our society. Those things are very deep and long-running things, and we have to recognize that they are decades, if not centuries, in the making. And we need to, but fortunately, we have the ability, we have the techniques, the techniques rather than the technology, to think about this in a systems way and start to tackle it. But there's no simple answer to any of that stuff. And I am, if you can tell, I am very concerned about it. I think it's a morally, ethically terrible thing to be happening in this country. Let me just tell you, I went to East Berlin in 1974 for some Stiftung, which paid for my trip along with a bunch of other people. And I came back, and then I was hosted in the West German embassy. And the West German ambassador stood with me and a group of students, and he said in perfect English, you should, and of course all the students understood, you should all go and visit somewhere like Liverpool, because you will not see anything like that in Germany. I'll just leave that hanging there.
Brilliant. John, we've got last two, David, last two questions, and then I'm going to wrap up on the dot. Rebecca, really important point about inclusivity and how we get any serious regeneration initiative, not just the 100 most important people in a place, but all those who've been left behind. And that's partly what the Big Tent is wanting to try and do, make sure we bring a civic and community footprint. And John Goddard, a great question about digital citizenship. And again, as Paul Goldsmith said, we think that this sort of digital format can be quite powerful. So, Rebecca, are you there? Is Rebecca there?
John's here if you want to hear from him.
John, are you here?
Yes. Okay. Just briefly about how do you move to a more inclusive model of innovation where taking account of the views of citizens. I've put in the chat something about the Voice North initiative. We started off in the North, it's now gone global, about involving citizens in the innovation process. And you can do that. There's lots of exciting things going on in what we call in Newcastle digital civics. And we still are stuck on a sort of linear model. We have the science and technology, we truck it over the fence and we hope it filters down. There is an opportunity to get citizens involved in the co-creation of knowledge in a really imaginative way.
Yeah.
There you go. Last question, David. There you go.
Yeah, I know. I absolutely agree with you, John. I think that the technologies that we've got available to us don't just offer the opportunity for trolls to go after people on Twitter. I mean, we actually, if we think creatively and constructively about this, then we can do some things about digital inclusion. And I think things like citizens' assemblies and other things like that are very, very important for mobilizing and giving people a sense of civic pride, a pride in their place, right? That's what is going. That's one of the most very important things to do. And was there anything else?
Tony Norberg. Tony, I know you wanted a question.
Yes, I got my question really, David actually answered partially, but my point is that there is some technology around, and it's very old tech, that will reduce the door-to-door commuting time for everybody in an area. So effectively what that does, it increases the density of, say, the northeast, and it then makes it a cluster, because within half an hour, which is a typical nice commute time, you can go all the way from the bottom of the northeast to the top. So the problem I've got is that whenever I want to talk to people about it, it's going to make use of the technology that is being developed, electric vehicles and stuff. And it will give all those benefits to all those people that are pushing their individual technology. But the difficulty is there's no way, because it's a system level problem, yes. There's nowhere, there's no forum for system level talk.
Go on, David. Give us some.
Okay.
Right. So
look, Tony, you're putting your finger right on it. It's not the fact that you can hurtle hundreds of people up a line and save them 20 minutes of commuting. No, it's for the mass of the population. Just how long is their commuting journey to work, and how does that operate? And we need to think about modern transport systems on that basis, not on the glitzy £100 billion stuff that, if I can't get from, as somebody said here, from Liverpool, the suburbs of Liverpool to Manchester, then we have got a serious problem.
Yeah. Okay, folks, I promised I'd wrap it up at 7:30. David, by way of thanking you, can I just say to everybody, I hope you've enjoyed that. A really fantastic, the nods speak for themselves on the comments. This is, I think, part of, what we're trying to do with the Meet the Leaders is have a genuine conversation, led and focused and stimulating and open. And if you are enjoying this and you think it's valuable, please come and help us. Now, that could mean become a member or encourage others to become members and friends, or get in touch with us and see if you might like to be a patron and help. And Dermot Campbell is taking over as our new CEO to guide us through this next phase while Paul battles and no doubt defeats his cancer. And we are about to start to share with patrons and friends our business plan for this year. And we've set out a whole range of projects. So if you're interested in what we're talking about and you'd like to come and help in our work around the country, help us get some new leaders, help us get some new thinking, keep Alex's comments there. It may be that you can help us in shaping our thinking, but in the end, we also do need money to pay the bills. So Dermot and Michael Holland will be in touch. We can't carry on without a bit of help, and we're very grateful to those of you who had. So I just close by, David, on behalf of everyone, thanking you for a great evening, some brilliant classic Cleevely polymath tour d'horizon of the challenge, and some really pithy conversations around and insights on some of the key issues. I suspect this group has got a pretty strong idea of how we could take the Cambridge effect and grow it around the country. And our challenge this year is to make sure that we get that voice picked up and fed through to policymakers. And that's the theme of the year's activities. David, thank you very, very much. Thanks all. And Georgie, can I just ask you to tell us when our next Meet the Leaders is?
February the 22nd with Jonathan Haidt from New York.
Brilliant. Be there, put it in the diary. David, many, many thanks.
Thank you, chaps. Thank you.